Salve omnes, and welcome back. In this video, we are going to be continuing with Caesar Book 4, following the AP Latin syllabus. And in this video, we will be going from chapters 28 through 31. So let's do a quick refresh on what happened in chapters 24 through 27. So we probably remember that those chapters covered Caesar's invasion of Britain, the difficulties he had landing his troops on the shore and repelling the enemy who were arrayed to repulse him, but he was ultimately successful because he is Caesar, except in that he was unable to pursue the fleeing enemy because of a lack of cavalry. The ships carrying the cavalry had not been able to make it to the island, and that is actually going to be one of the things that we start off talking about in this video. But regardless, Caesar did manage to drive off the Britons, after which they sent their legates to sue for peace and surrendered hostages, and are basically submitting themselves to Caesar. That is where we left off. So, as we pick up in this video, in this next chapter, his rebus pace confirmata. We see that Caesar is continuing on with an ablative absolute here. The ablative absolute itself is actually these two words right here, pace and confirmata, okay? And then this his rebus goes with them. So, with peace having been confirmed by these things, or with these things, all right, the enemy's decision to surrender hostages, and then their decision to submit themselves and their tribes to Caesar. So peace was confirmed by these things. When peace was confirmed by these things, after peace had been confirmed by these things, and then we continue on. Post diem quartum, the fourth day after. All right. Now, in English, we might say just something like 4 days later, but that's not what Caesar does here. The post goes with the quam. All right. So something like on the fourth day, post quam. After which, or just in English we would just say after, ventum est, there was an arrival in Britain. Now this is Caesar once again deploying his preferred impersonal passive verb constructions. We would prefer to say something like they arrived in Britain, the Romans arrived in Britain, our men arrived in Britain. But Caesar leaves it blank. So what we have to do here with the impersonal, so what we have to do here is we understand something like illis or nostris. We need to understand a dative going with this as a dative of agent. There was an arrival in Britain by our men. All right. So on the fourth day after there was an arrival in Britain by our men, naves duo de viginti. All right. 18 ships. That's the subject of our sentence right here. 18 ships. And then we find out about all of these ships. Well, what about these ships? Well, the first thing we learn is that they are the ships de quibus, about which, supra, up above, or previously, demonstratunt, mention was made. All right, there was a mentioning. Again, an impersonal construction. These are the ships quae, which had brought the equites. All right, these are the ships that had carried the cavalry. All right, so these are specifically the ones that we had learned were unable to make it to Britain in time for the landing. So what about these ships then? Well, ex superiore portu, from a more northern port. All right, and if you care about where, this is a location word, superiore, so further north, literally a higher upper port. There's a note in your book that explains where we think Caesar may have set out from. It's not terribly important to us as we read the Latin. It's just that they're setting out from a port. In a leni vento, in a gentle wind. All right, so that's very nice for sailing. Soluerunt. Literally, they released. But again, if you've sailed, you know that one of the things you have to do is you have to untie yourself from the dock. So they untied themselves. They set out is the ultimate meaning. So 4 days after they had arrived in Britain, 18 ships carrying the cavalry, which we'd mentioned before, set out from their port, which is up above. in a gentle breeze. All right, well, let's see what happens to them. Quai, this quai is the naves. All right, this quai is referring to the naves. This might as well be hike. Okay, hike naves, these ships. Cum ad propinquarent Britanniae. So we see Britanniae. We see that that is dative because datives go with apropinquo, this verb. It's not the first time we've seen this verb with a dative. And we see that apropinquarent is a subjunctive verb, imperfect subjunctive, which means this cum could potentially be anything. All right, it could be when, it could be since, or it could be although. However, in this instance, as in most, when does fine. All right, so when these ships were approaching Britain and from the camps viderentur, this is another true passive form of video, not seems, but they were seen. Okay, people saw them from the camps. These are the camps the Romans have constructed on the shores of Britain. Let's scroll down here to continue on and let's see what happens. So when they drew close and were seen by the camps, tanta tempestas subito cortast. Such a storm suddenly arose, deponent verb, orior, ut. Now this ut, it's worth noting, is not a purpose clause or an indirect command. It is a result clause. And how do I tell when an ut is doing a result clause? There's going to be a word in the previous clause, like you see right here, such as tanta, a word that means something like so much, so great, so something. All right, such a big storm that. All right, so what was the result of this being such a big storm? Nulla earum. This earum is the ships. All right, none of the ships, feminine plural, none of the ships were able to hold their course, posse tenere cursum, but, all right, and let's scroll down here so that we can see everything. All right, we see the alii, so we know that there's a some other relationship going on here. So some of the ships, eodem unde errant profectae, back to that same place, the dem, remember edem, this is the word that means same, to that same place from which, unde, they had departed, this is proficiscor, deponent verb, they were brought back, referentur. So some ships were driven back to where they started, where they had set out, while other ships, okay, what happens to other ships? What happened? Well, something about to the lower part of the island. This island, by the way, is Britain, naturally, which is, this quai is referring to the partem. So we're talking about where these ships were blown to. Where did these ships end up? They wound up basically at a lower part of the island. We would be tempted to say more southerly part, but Caesar explains quae est proprius solis ocassum. And remember, solis ocassum is the dying of the sun, therefore the west. So they wound up at a spot on the island, a lower spot on the island, which was more to the west. All right, so they were blown off course. They wound up to the west. They were thrown there, deicerentur. Okay, these are the alii. They were thrown to that lower part of the island, which is more to the west, magno suo cum periculo, with, this is a with great danger to themselves, we might say. This use of suis right here is something like to themselves, not, with their great danger. That doesn't make any sense. With danger to them. Okay, so they were blown that far away, and then quai, all right, and these are the ships. Okay, so however, what were they doing? All right, with ancoris iactis cum fluctibus. All right, so this right here, this ancoris iactis, is actually an ablative absolute. All right, it isn't indicated, but it should be. But this right here, ancoris iactis, is an ablative absolute. With their anchors having been cast, Okay, so basically, if we go back, the ships were blown off course. So what did they do? Well, they threw their anchors over to stop themselves from being cast all over creation by this wind. But when that happened, when they had thrown their anchors, what happened to the ships? They were filled, complerentur. They were filled cum fluctibus. They were filled with waves. So trying to anchor themselves in the ocean didn't work for Caesar's men. They were getting swamped by the waves. So let's finish this up. Necessario, by necessity. Adversa nocte. Now this means something like with night coming on or approaching or something like that, right? With night opposite, right? Because that's what we've seen adversus mean before, particularly in Virgil. On the other side, opposite. So this is something like with night being on the other side. So night was coming, okay? And why is it so important that night is coming? Well, in the ancient world, it was very, very uncommon for ships to sail at night simply because of how dangerous it was. So ships would sail during the day, staying close to shore, and then when night came on, they would pull up, beach themselves, and wait it out, basically. So because night is coming, what happened to our ships? Well, we also find out that they had been proectae in altum, which makes sense. They had been carried out into deep water, all right, by the storm. But what did they end up having to do? Petierunt continentem. They sought out the continent. So basically, they turned back, all right? So some of the ships that had set out when the storm hit were immediately driven back to the port where they set out from. Other ships tried to stick it out. They threw their anchors. They waited to see if the storm would go away, but it didn't work. They were overwhelmed by waves, and so when they saw that night was coming and they had been dragged back out into deep water, they had to go back and to the continent, which is to Europe. So once again, Caesar is disappointed in his expectation of assistance from the cavalry. So let's continue on. Okay, here we are in the next chapter then. So now something new happens. Having just been disappointed in his expectation of his cavalry ships arriving, eadem nocte, remember nocte adversa, night was coming on. That very same night, accidit, something happened. This is an impersonal verb. So that very same night, something happened. What was the something that happened? Well, basically this clause right here was the something that happened, and then we're going to find out what consequences that has. That. So on the very same night, it happened that there was a full moon. Okay. All right, a full moon. Well, if you sail and if you know what's up with the tides, a full moon is worth noting. And just to make matters worse, we then find out that this day, now this qui might as well be hic, all right, hic dies, okay, and this is explaining what was so significant about the full moon, okay, because a full moon happens every month, so why is this worth mentioning? Well, on the very same night it happened that there was a full moon. This day, okay, typically or customarily, or is in the habit of, consuesco, all right, typically made, because we see efficere is facere, so this day typically made a maritimos aestus maximos. This is something like an ocean surge, all right, an ocean swell or an ocean surge that was the biggest. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about the highest tide of the summer. All right, we're talking about that time of year when the full moon comes around and you get what is called a flood tide, and that is what the maritimos aestus maximos is referring to. So what is a flood tide? A flood tide is just basically what it sounds like, a very, very high tide. And again, this is not something that the Romans would have been accustomed to, as Caesar mentions down here. because the Mediterranean does not experience these the way that the ocean does. So this day typically made a very, very high ocean tide in the ocean, or a sea tide in the ocean. And to our men, right, for us, this thing was unknown. So not only did the previous day bring a storm that drove off his ships, but that very same night brought a flood tide. And let's see what the consequences are of that. All right, so we see right away that the very first consequence is thus all at one time, all in the same moment. All right, something like that. Both the longas naves and the honorarias. So we see that all of Caesar's ships are impacted by this tide in some way. All right, let's start with the longas naves, which again we remember refers to the warships. So the warships, and then we talk about what these ships are and where they are, on which, right, that's the quibus, on which Caesar had taken the care. Now this transportandum is a gerundive with exercitum. So in English we would say something like to transport his army. That's what we would say in English. In Latin it comes across something more like with which or on which Caesar had cared for his army which needed to be transported. Okay, but when you're translating, it's fine. On which Caesar had taken care to transport his army. Okay, and these are the warships which Caesar onto dry land had drawn up. Okay, so these ships were beached on the shore, which was typical practice back in the day. Okay, to beach your ships to prevent them from rotting by staying constantly in the ocean. What happened to the warships? The aistus complebat. The tide overwhelmed them. It filled them up. All right, so the tide swamped them. So that's bad. That's bad. And then we have the honorarias. Then we have the cargo ships. Quae ad ancoras erant deligatae. So these were tied up, deligatae, ad ancoras, at anchor. All right, because remember, these honorarias, these were too big. Caesar mentioned that back in chapter 24. They were too big to get close to shore. So they were just sitting at anchor offshore in the water. What happened to them? The tempestas adflictabat. The storm overwhelmed them, or it affected them. Okay, it blasted them, something like that. All right, and what was the consequence of all of this? Neque ulla facultas, and so no ability, we would say, right, something like that. And there was no opportunity for our men, this nostris is dative, either or, right, we see the out, either or, and then we see these gerunds, either of caring for them, because both of these words mean helping, right? There was no opportunity for our men either to help or to help. No opportunity for helping or helping was given, dabatur. Okay, but we have to distinguish between administror and auxilio, right? So it's something like for caring for the ships, like tending to them, administror, and then auxilio would be something, auxiliandi, something like helping in the more traditional sense. So no opportunity was given to our men either for taking care of the ships or for bringing them help. Okay, so that's pretty bad. Caesar's fleet has just been overwhelmed by the flood tide. Okay, so now that that's happened, let's see what the result is. And we start off with an ablative absolute, cum pluribus navibus fractis, which would make sense after such an event, with very many ships shattered, broken, ruined, right, wrecked. And we might say, even though there's no et here, it's okay, cum, all right, so this with essent, probably in this context because will work out the best for this particular cum, and we'll see why in just a second. Because the reliquae, these are the naves, referring to the naves, the remaining ships, the ones that weren't wrecked, were, then we get another ablative absolute, with ropes and anchors and all remaining armaments or tools or equipment, we would probably say. So ropes and anchors and all the other equipment was lost. Amisis. All right. What happened? They were, for sailing, useless. Okay. So many of the ships were wrecked, but because the rest of the ships were useless for sailing, why were they useless for sailing? Because all of their gear, ropes, anchors, and everything else was lost. A great, and then we have to come all the way down here to perturbatio, a great disturbance of, in English we might prefer to say in, but Latin uses this totius exercitus, which is genitive. A great disturbance of the entire army factast occurred or happened. We might just prefer to say there was. All right. A great disturbance of the whole army occurred. And then along the way, Caesar indicated, id quod necesse errata cidere. This thing was like had to happen. Okay, of course a great disturbance of the army occurred, given what just happened, right? All their fleet is ruined. Okay, let's continue on with the nature and extent of the difficulty that the Romans face. Neque enim naves errant aliae. So continuing on, enim, furthermore, there were no other ships. Neque aliae naves, no other ships. Quibus reportare possent, on which they could, this is referring to the soldiers, the Romans in general, reportari, a passive infinitive from porto portare, to carry. So there were no other ships on which they, the Romans, could be carried back. That means, of course, to Europe. All right, so they appear to be stuck on the island for now. Et omnia deerrant. We've seen this verb before, desum. And everything was lacking, right? Everything failed in the sense of was not there. Everything was lacking. Quae, that's the omnia, which for refitting the ships, right? This ad reficiendas naves as the gerundive of purpose expression, right? Because reficiendas, a gerundive with ad, is frequently used in Latin to express a purpose idea. So to refit the ships, to rebuild the ships, for the purpose of rebuilding the ships, everything was lacking which was of use. We've seen this use of usus before, which was useful to rebuild the ships. So there were no other ships to bring them back. They didn't have anything to rebuild the ships that were broken. And, just because we're not done yet, and we see right here what the issue is that this is talking about now, the grain. So, but before we get there, and quod, now this quod in the absence of any clear antecedent is probably because. All right, there's no antecedent yet. You might think, oh, but fermentum could be the antecedent, and it could. But in this context, it makes more sense as because. Because for everyone, it was decided to spend the winter in Gaul was best. So let's look at these verbs really quick. Constabat, right here, constabat, does not go to hiemari. It goes to oportere, all right, out here, okay? It was decided that it was best to spend the winter in Gaul. All right, that's what's going on right here with this clause. Because it was decided that it was best for everyone to spend the winter in Gaul. So this is in way of explanation. Because Caesar had already determined they were not going to spend the winter in Britain but in Gaul, the grain in these places, so where the Romans are on the island, for the winter. We notice this is an accusative right here, hiemem. All right, hiemem. That implies duration of time, even though it's in the prepositional phrase. For the winter, the grain non erat provisum, was not provided. So they sailed to Britain without enough food to make it through a winter, because that had never been the plan. All right, so that's a big problem. Okay, so following up on the unfortunate series of events that Caesar and the Romans have just endured, quibus rebus cognitus. So this quibus again is his. It's actually not qui, it's hic. His rebus cognitus, with these things being known. The Principes Britanni, remember these guys, the ones who were just pledging their loyalty to Caesar? The leaders of Britain, careful, not the British leaders, the leaders of Britain, who, after the battle to Caesar had come, right? Remember, they were pledging their allegiance. Inter se conlocuti. They were talking amongst themselves. Cum. And we look at this cum, and then we look down here at our verb intelligerent, and we see the imperfect subjunctive. So in this context, because is probably going to have to work, although when could be fine, right? When or because both the cavalry and the ships and the grain. Okay, now you'll notice these are all indicated as subjects, but they are in fact accusative. Not that you can necessarily tell just by looking, but take my word for it, they are all accusative. Why are they the subject? Because they are the subject of the indirect statement, which has de esse as its verb. We start with intelligerent. They, the Principes, they understood or recognized or realized that both cavalry and ships and grain, de esse, were lacking. Remember, it's the same verb again, desum. Were lacking dative for the Romans. So more colloquially, the Romans did not have cavalry, ships, or grain. They realized this. And, let's scroll down here because the sentence is quite long. And then we shift verbs right here. It's not intelligerent anymore. It's cognoscerent. They realized, means basically the same thing. Literally the small number of soldiers. Okay, so not only are the Principes aware of the lack of supplies for the Romans, but they are also cognizant, right, to use a cognate. They are also aware that the number of soldiers the Romans have is small. And how do they realize this? Ex castrorum exequitate. Literally, from the narrowness or smallness of the camps. All right, which camps? Why should this be a clue? Okay, this castrorum right here is the subject, is the antecedent, of quae. It's what quae is referring to. So the enemy realize the small number of soldiers the Romans have from the smallness of the camps, which were even smaller than this. Okay, so this is an ablative of comparison with angustior. So not only are the camps small, they're thin, they're narrow, but in fact, the situation is even worse than that because, all right, sine impedimentis, without baggage, Caesar had transported his legions. So this is essentially explaining that, yes, the camps are smaller than a typical Roman camp would be, and so the enemy are divining from that fact the reality that the Romans don't have a large number of soldiers with them. But Caesar goes on to explain that what makes it even worse is that the camps are even smaller than they would be because Caesar brought his legions over without their baggage. Okay, so normally a camp would be a particular size because you have all of the tools and equipment and everything else that the legions would carry with them. But Caesar left those things in Europe. So the camps are even smaller, which highlights the fact that the enemy are able to realize, there are not a lot of soldiers here because there isn't a very large camp that the Romans have built. So because of all of these things, because they realize and recognize all of these things, the enemy, still the Principes, right? The enemy duxerunt. Now, we've seen this before. This is not duco ducere, to lead. This is the other version, the other translation of duco, which means something like to realize or to have the opinion. Okay? So the enemies concluded that, this is all indirect speech right here, it was best, optimum esse, it was best to act. All right, factu. Something like it was the best time to do this, or it was best to act, okay, with a rebellione facta, with a rebellion being started or made. All right, what was the thing that they wanted to do? What was best to do? Okay, what was best to do is described in the infinitives that are coming. All right, what was best to do was to prohibere, all right, to prevent our men or to keep our men from grain, all right, fermento, and comeatu. Now this verb means travel, but specifically it's referring to retreat, all right? Don't allow our men to get grain. Don't allow our men to have the opportunity to retreat, okay? And then, producere rem. This is duco. You see it in there. Don't be fooled by the pro. You can ignore the pro. Ducere. Lead out the situation. So, extend the situation in hiemem until winter. All right. So the Barbari, the Britanni, are talking about keeping the Romans here in Britain until the winter by denying them food and the opportunity to leave. Because, why is this the best thing to do? Okay, let's scroll down here to the end. Because, ablative absolutes, his superatis, once the Romans had been conquered, okay, and reditu interclusis. Now, interclusis has his as its subject. Once the Romans had been cut off from a retreat, this is that comeatu up above. All right, so once they had conquered the Romans and cut them off from a retreat, and then if we want to, we can go all the way down here to confidebant to get things started. The Barbari were confident. No one afterwards, for the purpose of waging war, all right, inferendi is a gerundive with belli, all right, and they're both genitive because of causa, for the sake of waging war, into Britain would come. Transiturum. You see the iturum right there, future participle. No one later on would come to Britain to wage war. So the way the Britanni are thinking is, if we defeat the Romans here and now, no one's ever going to invade us again, because we will have defeated the superpower of the world. All right? So that is their plan. That is why they think it is best to do these things now. All right. Itaque. And so, rursus coniuratione facta. So once again, right, rursus is one of these temporal words, means over again or something like that. With this conspiracy having been made, this is so the Principes are done talking amongst themselves. And remember, these Principes are various leaders and tribal leaders from lots of different tribes. So it's not just a matter of one guy in charge making the decision. All of these guys have to come together to make a decision, which is why it's a coniuratione. So the conspiracy was made, and so once again, little by little, paulatim, little by little, because this shows how cautious the Britanni are being, from the camps to depart. These are the Roman camps, by the way, and their own men quietly from the fields to lead back, they began. So we come to the end of the sentence and we see what the Barbari are actually doing. They are starting to leave from the camps. Remember, they had all shown up at the Roman camps to pledge their loyalty to Caesar, but now they're starting to leave slowly, paulatim, little by little. And they're also starting to bring back, deducere, their men, suos, ex agris, from the fields. Because if you remember, when the battle was over, Caesar also commanded that everyone should go back to their fields, remigrare. Okay? But now the leaders are calling their men back. Why are they doing this? Because they're raising their army once again. They're doing it little by little, okay? And they're also doing it clam, which means secretly, quietly. Okay, so the Barbari are gearing up for an attack. And this is how Caesar responds. At Caesar. Oh yes, here we go. But Caesar. Et si non duneorum consilia cognoerat. So right away, cognoerat. Right away we see that Caesar is already thinking about this. Even though not yet their plans he had learned. Okay, so Caesar was not yet aware of the plans of the enemy. All right, doesn't matter though. Nevertheless, both from the outcome of his ships, so basically what had happened, that's the eventu, from what had happened to his ships, don't let that fool you, this is genitive, right, navium suarum, and ex eo, from this thing. Now, what thing are we talking about? Caesar doesn't tell us right away. Well, he tells us down here with this quod clause. From the fact that intermiserant, they, this is the Barbari, they had stopped giving hostages. Literally, this intermitto means something like to interrupt. So they had interrupted the giving of hostages. So that presumably was Caesar's first clue. Apart from the fact that he realized, given what had happened to his navy, he was expecting some treachery from the barbarians, then there was the fact that they had stopped giving their hostages all of a sudden. All right? So Caesar was suspicious that fore, and remember, this fore is futurum esse. All right, it's the future infinitive. It would happen, or it would be. Well, what would happen? Id quod accidit, right? Literally, the thing that happened. So if we were to translate this literally, it would be something like, Caesar was suspicious that something would happen that actually happened. All right, so we see Caesar getting ready for it. He suspects that something bad is going to happen. Let's see how he deals with it. And so, right, here we go. And so, ad omnes casus, for every misfortune, subsidia comparabat. This is still Caesar. Caesar prepared aid, assistance, right, plans. He made plans. He made plans for every outcome, for every misfortune. All right, 4, right, so we're explaining. Right, he's got lots of plans. So, the grain, let's deal with the grain problem. The grain from the fields every single day, quotidie, daily, into the camps conferebat, all right? So, he brought grain, because this is not passive, grain was not brought. He brought grain from the fields daily into the camps, so that's addressing the food issue. And now, this quae right here is referring to the naves, okay? So this quae so we would say the ships which, all right, were most severely afflicted or ruined, okay? And then this earum right here is also the ships, all right? So the ships which were most grievously afflicted of their material and brawn. So this material would be like wood and sails and ropes and other things like that. And bronze, of course, is bronze. All right. And then, of course, why are these in the ablative? Materia atque aere, because of utebatur. So he used the ships, their material and bronze to, it's another gerundive purpose expression with odd, to repair the rest, right? Because remember, lots of his ships were ruined, but the rest were simply rendered incapable of sailing. So he's using the material from the ruined ships to repair the other ships. All right. And, let's scroll down, and things which, now you'll notice this whole clause is highlighted blue. That means it's the object of eubebat down here. All right, but we're still going to read it as it comes. The things which, quae res, the things which were of use to this, which is to say the repairing of the ships. All right, you could read the res with the eos as well, like as part of the prepositional phrase. I just read it with the quae, like the whatever was of use to this purpose, which is the refitting of the ships, from the continent to be brought, he ordered. Okay, so literally this whole clause right here is the object of eubebat. He ordered the things that were useful for refitting the ships to be brought over from Europe. Okay, so he presumably was able to send a message back saying, send us gear as fast as you can. All right, and so we're going to see how this all ends right here. And so notice that this right here, two things. Don't let this cum fool you. Notice this verb down here. This is an imperfect subjunctive verb, administraretur. So this cum is not going with sumo studio. All right, this is not with the greatest zeal. All right, it's because this was taken care of, an impersonal verb. This was taken care of by the soldiers with the great, I mean, sumo studio gets translated with the greatest zeal, but that doesn't mean it's taking the cum. All right, this cum is because with administraretur. All right, don't get fooled. Because this situation was taken care of by the soldiers with the greatest zeal, okay, with 12 ships lost. So out of his whole fleet, he lost 12 ships. He made it, right, or he made it possible ut. This ut is a result clause. All right, it's a result clause with a fecit. He brought about this result. What is the result? He brought it about that it was possible. This has no subject. Paul said it has no subject. It is another impersonal verb. It was possible for, this reliquis is dative, for the remaining ships to be sailed, passive infinitive, to be sailed satis commode. Something like well enough, right? We see the satis. So the ships are not necessarily in tip-top shape, but they are good enough to sail, and that is all that Caesar needs. And so we've seen him undergo a great trial. We've seen the Barbary start to plot against him, but he knows it's coming, or at least he suspects it's coming, and he has started fixing things and addressing the issues that he has as quickly and efficiently as he possibly can. And so in the next video, we will see how effective his preparations and plans were. All right, gratias for sticking through to the end, and walete.